Hello, everyone. This is Stephanie Boozer with CUGC HQ. I am thrilled to welcome you to today's user share webinar, the EUC State of the Union. Marius has done this with us for, I think this is the third year. It's always a lot of information, a lot of great stuff, and I know that today is no different. He has a big agenda for us, so I'm just going to take a couple minutes and then I'm going to turn things over to him. First, I just want to, hold on, there we go. Want to remind you that we have our Excel calendar out for 2022. Next week is our virtual Excel. It's on March 10th. I hope you'll join us for that. We've got Jack Harrington. He is with Oracle Red Bull Racing. He's going to do our keynote discussion, and you'll be able to ask some questions talking about, their implementation of Citrix and their partnership. So I'm sure that one's going to be really awesome. Plus, we have a lot of great speakers lined up, including, I think, our pregame is with Dan Feller. And if you don't know about Dan Feller's astrophotography, you should totally come. He is amazing with his camera and capturing all of the stuff out in outer space. So definitely join us for that. Also, the next Excel that we have coming up will be in person in Kansas City. We'll have that at Arrowhead Stadium on May 19th, and that is open to everyone. You don't have to live in Kansas City. We've got travel information for you out on the website. So just go check out our events calendar, and hopefully we'll see you at one of these events. All right, so before we get started, I just want to remind you that we are recording today's presentation, and you will get a link to that recording tomorrow, and that is going to come to you directly from GoToWebinar, so be on the lookout for that. Also, I know Marius has a big agenda, but I do want you to put your questions in as you have them, so put those in the question panel at any time, and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can today. And then finally, you'll get a short survey to fill out, just anonymous. We like to get your feedback, so be on the lookout for that. All right, I am going to hand things over to Marius's capable hands. Marius has, like I said, he's been doing this for us for, I think this is the third year. He is a big presence in the community. We always love to have this State of the Union address. It's great to find out what's going on and what to look forward to. So screenshot this page because it's got all of his contact information on there, including info about his podcast. So with that, I'm going to hand things directly over to you, Marius. I'm going to send you the screen right now. Here it comes.
And there we go. Thank you, Stephanie. Just give me 1 second here and I'll get this shared. Hopefully you can see my screen now.
I can.
Good. There we go. Should work. Yeah, just some small adjustments. So welcome everybody, and happy to be here. As Stephanie said, this is the third time that I had a State of the Union. It's about trying to do a recap of all the announcements and features and updates that we've seen through the last year. And of course, like last year, there's been a lot of new content, features, updates, new products that have been announced that I want to talk a little bit about the next hour or so. And of course, there's a lot of content I wasn't able to fit into the agenda, so sorry about that. But there's going to be a lot of links in this presentation for different, where you find more information, sign up to different preview programs, and so on. I've already uploaded this presentation here, so you can go and find it at my GitHub page, where you have access to the presentation with all the links and so on. But my name is Stephanie said, I'm Mari Sambu. I work for a company called Sopra Steria, based in Norway. Focus primarily on public cloud and in combination with end user computing. So as Stephanie said, if you have any questions, feel free to ask them in the Q&A window. And if not, you can reach out to me on any social media platform. You can find me and I'll try to answer as much as I can. If we have any time at the end, I'll try to answer any questions that we might have then. So let's start. So the agenda that I want to talk over the next hour or so, talk about public cloud. There's been a lot of updates to Azure, Amazon, Google, but in addition to that, we had a lot of big outages. So we talk a little bit about that, how we can handle monitoring and availability. Also talk a little bit about Azure Virtual Desktop and Windows 365, new announcements and features that we saw there. And also talk a little bit about AppV and what the future holds in terms of with MSIX and third-party alternatives that we have there. And of course, there's been a lot of updates related to Citrix Virtual Apps and Desktop, both on a protocol, availability, new authentication mechanisms, Rendezvous version 2, which also will make the availability and connectivity a little bit easier. We'll also talk a little bit about updates into Microsoft and Citrix from a integration perspective, and also a little bit about new ways to provide access to internal applications using magic tunnels. And of course, finally, try to wrap into other updates that I've found, which might be of interest for related to VMware, and also some others related to Google as well. But before I start on the main agenda, one thing that I want to start with is talking a little bit about security. And of course, 2021 was a pretty hectic year from a security perspective. We had a lot of high severity vulnerabilities, and NIST stated that last year there were over 18,000 CVEs that were published, which is a much higher number than it was the year before. And they also state that there will be even more vulnerabilities this year as well. So it means that we have our hands full in terms of patching, having workarounds in place to make sure that we don't have any vulnerable external services. So one of the couple of things that we saw, one is for Log4Shell, which of course came in late December, and we didn't know the full impact of that vulnerability at the time. Luckily, it went over pretty quickly, but we still see that a lot of products, specifically from VMware, are heavily using that module heavily. So we see now that a lot of ransomware groups are attacking Horizon services that have Log4j or haven't patched the Log4j vulnerability. Of course, have Print Nightmare, which ruined a lot of summer vacations. We also saw that that it was a pretty simple to use vulnerability, that from a domain joined machine, you could easily get full access to domain controllers using free open source tools that were available. And the creator behind Mimikatz had a pretty simple set of tools that you can use to actually start to utilize that vulnerability. So, of course, it took Microsoft a couple of attempts before they were actually able to fix that vulnerability. I know that once they released a patch, someone from the community started to find a new workaround, and then we needed to wait again for a new patch. So we also noticed that there's a lot of services that shouldn't be running on a domain controller, such as the print spooler service. But this impacted more the end user aspect, since, well, a lot of the users that are logging into Citrix or VMware or RDS, they need to be able to print some way. So it's that was a pretty took a long time. And then we have proxy logon for Exchange. We had the MS-HTML RCE, which came out, I think it was in September. But the MS-HTML is the HTML engine that runs within Windows. So this vulnerability only required that a user opened up a document within the File Explorer and the Preview pane there to actually run this specific vulnerability. So we see a lot of RCEs now, or vulnerabilities, being attached to either a web browser or JavaScripts directly within the operating system. And of course, we had Kaseya, which had a ransomware attack. We're seeing new world records being broken and different DDoS attacks. So this record here is something that Microsoft documented in December. And a couple of days ago, we also saw NVIDIA that was attacked with a ransomware attack. So we see now these high-profile companies almost on a daily basis being targeted by ransomware attacks. And of course, it's not just about getting access and encrypting data. The attackers now, they are also using another strategy, which is actually getting data out and storing it on their servers, and then doing a type of reverse auction, where they say that either you pay us X amount of cryptocurrency, or we will publish all the information that we have directly onto the internet if you don't pay up. So let's start on with some positive news and talk a little bit more about what's going on with Windows. So last year, Microsoft released Windows 11 and Windows Server 2022, which of course didn't introduce a lot of new services or a lot of new features or security mechanisms for that matter. They made some small adjustments to the introduction of HTTP3, which is now part of the OS networking stack. They support DNS or HTTPS. They also made some small adjustments to TCP protocol. So by default now all web traffic from a Windows client at least is using a new congestion algorithm, which is much more optimized for traditional web browsing. And of course, they, for some reason, introduced a new native Teams client into the operating system, which means that we have more stuff that we need to remove from the golden image before we put it into production. In addition to this, Microsoft also said for Windows 11, they will have a requirement for TPM2. So it means that you need to have a TPM chip on your device which supports the TPM2 specification. This was required if you wanted to install Windows 11. You will get an error message if it didn't fulfill the requirement. Now this was only for Windows 11, not for 2022. But it seems in the latest Insider edition now that they're moving to a little bit softer approach because they've got a lot of feedback from end users. So if you install Windows 11 and you don't have TPM installed, you will get this type of watermark saying that system requirements are not met. Now, from a Citrix hypervisor perspective, Windows 11 is not supported yet, but Windows Server 2022 is. And I'm guessing that's the TPM requirement is only for Windows 11 and not for 2022. I also took a closer look at how does these new operating systems perform in a virtualized environment. Now, luckily, there's a lot of great guys in the community that have been working on doing benchmarking tests for Server 2012 and 11 in a Citrix environment and comparing it to Windows 10, Windows 2019. So there's not much of a difference here. The only big difference is that Windows Server 2022 uses a lot more CPU than the older versions. There is also one last thing, and that is that Microsoft is removing support for Microsoft 365, so Office applications on Server 2022. So we had this stance with Microsoft, I think it was with Server 22 or 2016, where they removed the support and then they got a lot of feedback and then they introduced the support again. But now again, they're removing the support for 2022. Well, I'm guessing that Microsoft's overall strategy is saying that, okay, if you want to run Office virtualized, you need to move to Windows 10, which for some reason is a lot more cheaper to run in Azure because then you can use multi-session Windows 10 or multi-use of Windows 11. So I'm guessing that's their overall strategy here in terms of pushing customers to use virtualized Office applications in Azure. So when it comes to the adoption of public cloud, I just want to highlight this a little bit because when you're starting to adopt and move services to public cloud, you're also moving into a new ecosystem. And there's so much changing parts happening almost daily. And this is one of the useful charts that I found from one of the researchers from Gartner, which showcases how much changes that are being done within public cloud on a yearly basis. So you can see, for instance, for 2019, Amazon had close to 2,000 new changes that year alone. Azure had close to 1,200 and pretty much the same for the Microsoft 365 ecosystem. Now, this shows the trend the last 5 years, and the rate of change is even higher now in 2022 and 2021 than it was the years before. So we're moving to cloud also means moving to new ecosystem and need to focus much more on looking into all the new changes that are happening, even though because these changes are going to be introduced regardless if we want to or not. It also was a question here in terms of GCP change numbers. I can find the exact number, but I think it's close to 800, 900 changes in 2019. And in 2021, Google had close to 1,100 new changes. That was the latest number that I found. So Jason, hopefully that answered your question. Now, one thing also that when we move to public cloud, we're much more reliant on them to provide infrastructure and services. And of course, like in most organizations, public cloud providers also have a bad day. And Amazon had a pretty bad week in December last year. One of the things that I noticed, because my son plays some Fortnite, and he said to me on December the 7th, he couldn't log in for some reason. So Fortnite was down. My doorbell, I have a Ring doorbell, which didn't work at the time. I also had a couple of friends say to me that their vacuum cleaner didn't work, and all of this just because Amazon had an outage in one of the data centers in US on the East Coast. So this, of course, impacts a lot of services on a global scale, because they have some dependency on services that are running in the US East 1 data center. And a week later, they also had an issue on another data center on the West Coast. This was just a power outage, so it didn't impact as much services as the previous one, but still, it's something that happened. And in October, Microsoft also, I wouldn't say they didn't have an outage, but there was an issue with the Azure VM agent. So all Windows machines in Azure have an agent installed, which allows communication from the operating system to the Azure Fabric. Now, Microsoft made some changes here, which of course impacted so that the Azure agent didn't work. Now, that also means that if you had virtual machines running in Azure, you were not able to start them, you weren't able to stop them, you couldn't make any changes to any machine running in Azure on any region. So, and this was an outage that lasted for 8 or 9 hours or so. So it made my day pretty busy, to be perfectly honest, to actually figure out what was going on. And when stuff like this happens, right, we just have to wait for the cloud provider to get things up and running again. There's not much that we can do to actually make an impact or make things working again. We just need to have control of the services that we have, or make sure that services that we are running are getting up and running again. The second part is monitoring. Because in most cases, like the last 5 years, there's been a lot of different outages related to AWS or Microsoft Azure or Office 365. And in, I would say, 9 out of 10 cases, the status page will not reflect what's actually going on. And I have to go on Twitter or social media somewhere, or talk with someone in the community that actually says that, hey, there's something wrong with Azure or something wrong with AWS. So in most cases, or what I've found out is that I don't always trust the status page, because like Microsoft and Amazon, they need to be 100% sure there's something wrong before they actually publish when something's not working as intended. So what I've been doing more and more is having a monitoring tool that can monitor the cloud from the outside. So if you have like Azure Virtual Desktop, there's a lot of known endpoints that you can probe for, just making sure that the port is open, it's responding with within a certain threshold of latency. So I've been using a tool called Uptime Kuma, which is a free open source tool, runs as a container, and then you can just specify what kind of endpoints it can monitor, TCP, HTTP, just to get some feedback what's going on. And there are, of course, a lot of third-party tools, which Marcel points out in the chat here with Scout Bees as well. But it is, at least it's, of course, as I said, you can't impact how the cloud provider is going to get stuff up and running again, but it's having a tool that can notify you before your users start to notify you that something's not working, as at least a good starting point. And then we, of course, have GPUs. I was working on a couple of projects a couple of months ago where we're looking into if we can move a VDI workload running with GPU to public cloud. And of course, looking at the GPU offerings now within Amazon Web Services or Microsoft Azure, they're pretty stuck on a lot of old GPU cards. So for instance, Microsoft, they have the NVV3 series, which provides the M60 card, which is now already 7 years old. But one of the reasons why this happens is that if a cloud provider wants to provide, let's say, the A10 card, which was released last year, they need to have a certain quantity before they're actually able to provide it as a service. And unfortunately, we have different scalpers and cryptocurrency miners that are now buying up every GPU card that they can get a hold of. And I spent like 4 months waiting for a GPU card that I wanted for my new computer at home. So it's kind of difficult for cloud providers as well to gain access to this. Now, of course, I borrowed this chart as well from NVIDIA, which showcases what kind of GPU cards that they have available from within the different cloud providers. Amazon has also now introduced support for the AMD V520 card, which is only available as a public cloud offering. And while I was creating this slide, it was more of a rant in terms of why doesn't the cloud providers have new support for the newer GPU cards? But yesterday or the day before, Microsoft released a preview for the new A10 GPU cards, which is now in public preview in certain regions. So if you want to sign up for preview or getting access to the public preview, I add a link here as well. We'll get more information as well in a couple of weeks' time, so we get information about pricing, but the different SKUs and how much GPU capacity you get for the different types is also already documented. And then we have, well, a lot has happened within Microsoft Azure with Windows 365 and Azure Virtual Desktop. So I just want to start talking a little about the differences between these two different products, because even though they provide much of the same functionality, there are a little bit differences under the hood. So Azure Virtual Desktop, which was released about 2 to 3 years ago, has two main parts. You have the Windows components, which is the platform services, which consists of the connection flow, the management plane, licensing, web portal, and so on. And then you have the virtual machines that we are responsible for, which is Windows client, Windows 10, Windows 11, Windows Server, and it has an agent installed that is communicating back to the control plane that Microsoft sets up. And of course, the communication flow from an end user's perspective goes from the end user's machine to the control plane that Microsoft is responsible for that runs in Azure, and then to the backend VDI running within our subscription in Azure. So this is the, I would say, high-level design of Azure Virtual Desktop. And then we have Windows 365, which was released last year, which is pretty much of the same components. They have the same communication flow, the same protocol, but Microsoft is also responsible for the VDI or the machine in the backend as well. So they set up and control everything. We just assign machines to end user. So even though it's much of the same components, they are designed for different purposes. So Windows 365 is designed for simplicity, right? You assign a user, you assign the license to a user, they get access to a Windows 10 or a Windows 11 machine. So it's a one-to-one relationship between the user and the machine they get access to. And of course, from a management perspective, Windows 365 is managed through Endpoint Manager. Azure Virtual Desktop is controlled through Azure. There are also minor differences as well when it comes to what kind of virtual machine type you can choose from. So within Windows 365, you get a predefined SKU type. So you can specify how much CPU memory I get and how much disk that I want to have. So that also means that we can't use Windows 365 in combination with GPU machines, for instance, but that is something that we can choose if we use Azure Virtual Desktop. So there's not a lot of difference between the two products. Also have some of the same limitations. For instance, they don't support full single sign-on natively. If, for instance, that you have, if you have Azure AD joined directly. There's also minor difference in terms of the traffic protocol, because Azure Virtual Desktop supports something called shortpath, which allows the end user to connect directly to a session host using a UDP-based protocol, which provides higher throughput and better overall latency. But this is not supported for Windows 365 yet. And this was something that the program manager for Windows 365, Scott Manchester, posted on Twitter and starting of February. So I'm guessing that that this is something they're working on and will be available soon. So I also saw this as a question from Alan, is that Windows 365 is sold as always on 24/7 per user, and that is correct. So when you assign a user, you pay a license fee regardless if the machine is running or not. So if we compare Windows 365 to Azure Virtual Desktop, there will be, of course, some price differences. We can set up Azure Virtual Desktop with reserved capacity. So we reserve compute capacity for either 1 or 3 years. So the example that I have in the middle here is reserved capacity for 3 years. In addition to like the compute, CPU memory and disk, we also have the bandwidth cost. It's not much, but it's different variable costs that will impact your overall cost for AVD in Azure. And of course, there might be an addition to security mechanisms that you might have, or you can run AVD with a predefined schedule saying that AVD is only available 8 hours a day, and then the cost would be, of course, a little bit different. But then you can't reserve capacity because you're only using virtual machines for X amount of hours per day. But of course, AVD also has the advantage that you can use that in combination with multi-user desktops. So of course, depending on the requirement, this might be a cost reduction regardless of which type of deployment model you choose. There is, of course, going to be a lot of new features coming out here as well. First off is Windows 365 will be coming with support for nested virtualization. So you can set up a Windows 365 machine and run virtual machines on top if you want to do this for a lab environment. Azure Virtual Desktop has now introduced support for Azure Stack Hyperconverged. Now the control plane will still be running on Azure, but you can run the virtual machines on-prem on your hyperconverged infrastructure. So this is more like of a licensing enhancement than anything else because there hasn't been any technical limitations. You can also use FSLogix with purely Azure AD joint devices against Azure files. Now, even though this doesn't sound incredibly sexy, but it is, Microsoft made a lot of work because Azure Files only supports Kerberos authentication. So they needed to make a way to translate authentication flows coming from Azure AD to Azure Files and then translate it back to Kerberos in the back end. So that means you can set up fully Azure AD joined devices in Azure with FSLogix authenticating to an Azure file share without any need to communicate with any domain controllers at all. But of course, you still need to have a hybrid identity, meaning that you have users synchronized out from a domain controller out to Azure Active Directory. Microsoft also introduced different scaling mechanisms. One thing is something called auto scaling, where you can define that a host pool within AVD should scale up and down based on a predefined schedule. So you can say that all machines should be starting at 7 a.m. or 60% of machines should be starting at 7 a.m. and the remaining should start throughout the day. You also have something called Start on VM Connect, which if you have a personal desktop, so one machine that is associated directly to an end user and that user logs onto the remote desktop application, Azure will automatically power on that user's machine directly. ShortPath is now GA as well, as I talked about. That's providing UDP-based transport to VDI or machines in Azure. That requires that the end user has direct site to the machine that's trying to connect to. So either that the user is connecting to VPN or it's sitting on an office which has a VPN connection to Azure. You can, of course, assign a VDI machine with public IP to actually provide the same functionality, but it's not recommended. We also have multimedia redirection in preview. That is multimedia redirection from within a browser. So it's now supported for Microsoft Edge and Chrome, but it requires that you have an extension installed. And if I remember correctly, as part of the preview, this is now limited to YouTube-based content at the moment. And of course, if you're looking into moving to Azure Virtual Desktop, there are different ways to do management. You can either use, of course, the portal and click around and set up host pools, or you can do more of an infrastructure as code approach where you use Terraform or Bicep to set the environment up and down. You can also use third-party tools such as Nerdio to actually do management of the environment. And also that ControlUp also introduced monitoring capabilities for AVD and the latest release that they have. There's also more lightweight options such as AVD Hydra, which is someone from the community, I can't remember his name, which made a more lightweight approach to do management of AVD environments as well. So of course, there's a lot of stuff going on within the AVD space. There's also a lot of other nifty updates when related to Azure. First off is live disk resizing. So now I can resize a disk from one SKU to another within Azure without actually doing a reboot. So this is something that we had in VMware for like forever, but it's now only, it was pretty, not so long ago since this was now getting available within Azure. You also have on-demand disk bursting, which means that you can flip a switch and the disk within Azure will get I think it's double the performance as long as that feature is enabled, and then you can go back and switch off the service again without actually needing to do any disk resizing. And then you have a new feature that was announced during Ignite, something called Gateway Load Balancer. So when you want to provide third-party network appliances within Azure, such as Citrix ADC or F5 or Palo Alto, they rely typically on layer 2 protocols to do high availability, such as GARP or reverse ARP. Now, these protocols are not supported in Azure. So what we need to do to actually provide high availability is actually set up a load balancer in Azure in front of the other load balancers that you might have. So with the Gateway Load Balancer, they actually streamlined this process, and there's already a lot of reference architectures how you can use Gateway Load Balancer in front of Citrix ADC, for instance. You also have Azure Auto-Manage, which is trying to simplify operations of virtual machines in Azure. So Auto-Manage will automatically set up backup, patch management, enable different security features, set up Azure Monitor to monitor virtual machines, and also monitor change in file tracking. So you enable the service, and then you define if a machine is production or dev and test, and it will automatically apply predefined settings from Microsoft. So this now supports Windows and Linux. And then we have routing preferences. This is now something that's available for all public IP addresses, and this controls the way traffic flows from an end user going to a public IP service in Azure. So by default, it's set to Internet routing preference. Now, if we switch it from Internet to Microsoft network-based, it means that all traffic going to a public IP in Azure will always start where the closest Azure point of presence is. So if I have a service running in West Europe on a public IP, and I connect from my client in Norway, it will try and find that public IP through the internet and go from my ISP and then travel down to West Europe. If I switch this to Microsoft Network, it will go to the closest Azure data center that we have in Norway, and then we will go through the Azure backbone and, of course, reduce the overall latency. So where are we at cloud support when it comes to these two different providers? Of course, looking at AVD, it of course supports only Microsoft Azure virtual infrastructure. Citrix Cloud provides support for all the different flavors, either it's Microsoft, Google, Amazon. They also support the different VMware-based services as well. So where you set up fully vCloud Foundation offering within one of the cloud providers' data centers. Now, VMware also provides much of the same functionality, but they're of course focusing on purely Azure native or supporting the VMware-based offerings within the different cloud providers. And there are also, of course, some differences as well when it comes to image provisioning, because Azure and AVD by default doesn't have any built-in image provisioning. You need to either use Azure Image Builder, which is an additional service in Azure, or you need to build it up manually, while Citrix and VMware, on the other hand, has built-in image provisioning services within Microsoft Azure. Now, I made this chart about a year ago, and of course, there's been a lot of changes here between the different three different providers, both in terms of monitoring capabilities, enhancements to the protocol. But of course, Citrix and VMware will always focus more on not just providing virtual apps and desktops, but also integrating other applications, web applications, SaaS applications that you might have within the same ecosystem. But if you want to provide like web applications within Azure Virtual Desktop, you would need to use some other service within Azure, such as Azure Application Proxy or integrated with Azure AD and provided as part of Office 365, for instance. So I think that's one of the main limitations that we see right now, in addition to having like a native single sign-on mechanism that supports SAML authentication, which hopefully Microsoft will have sometime soon. So moving on to AppV, this is of course something that I spoke a little bit about in the last year's session as well. Now we have some time left before the new extended end of extended support is, which is in 2026. So I'm going to talk to Microsoft because there's not any active development being done on AppV. So what kind of options do we have if we want to migrate our applications to still be supported after the extended support is, or if we want to have support for new operating systems? So the typical answer we get from Microsoft is MSIX, which is the new application framework that they have, which is not about just providing virtualized applications, but it's also a framework for other types of applications that Microsoft is building. So, of course, Microsoft has released a lot of guidelines, documentation and examples of how you can convert AppV to MSIX. There's also now a lot of great tools available, open source tools such as MSIX Hero, which also makes it easier to manage MSIX applications. And then there's, of course, a lot of information in communities from Tim Manigan, which one of the great guys behind a lot of the work in AppV, in the AppV community, has also worked on a report card where he goes through 75 applications and shows the compatibility level, comparing it to AppV and MSIX, and how much of the applications that are supported in AppV is supported on MSIX. So he has, of course, pretty good documentation showcasing what kind of features that are not currently supported, and also how to work around different limitations. But there's also been a lot of enhancements into MSIX from a client perspective. One of the new things that recently came out is support for shared package containers, context menus, shell extension support. But of course, for a lot of heavily packaged or customized applications, AppV, it's not good enough. So of course, one of the things that I've been hearing more and more about is a product called cloud paging from Numescent, which I see that a lot of people from the community have already written a lot about. And Rory Monahan has already written a lot of blog posts about the life app after AppV, where he's written a lot of good good content on how you can use cloud paging as an alternative to MSIX and AppV. It's also done a comparison on the whatmatrix.com website, where it goes into different features and what is supported in cloud paging compared to the two other platforms. But of course, this is just one of the alternatives. There are also other alternatives available, but I see more and more positive feedback on cloud paging. So looking ahead and looking at some of the new features and services that have been announced from Citrix throughout the last year, if I remember correctly at least, but one of the products that was announced and released is something called Citrix Secure Internet Access, which is of course looking into protecting users from cloud-based applications. Because much of today's ransomware attacks typically start with a user visiting a certain malicious URL and downloading some attachments running on their device. So with secure internet access, it's essentially an internet, I would say a simple internet proxy service, where traffic is either going from your device, which has an agent installed, to the different Citrix points of presence that they have, or going from an office that you're connected to that has an SD-WAN connection to this centralized service. And then you have different security mechanisms in between that will look into the traffic flow, different firewall mechanisms, optimizing your traffic flow, malware protection. In addition, that you have cloud access security brokers, which will have different API integrations with the different SaaS applications and look into the application from an API perspective, what's actually going on within Office 365, or what's actually going on within Salesforce, or what kind of, or any other type of SaaS application that you might have. So protecting users from the internet, basically. And then we have Citrix Secure Private Access, which I'm guessing they use the CTNA term now, but essentially providing secure access to internal applications, not about desktops or Windows applications, but web-based applications or other applications that might require TCP and UDP-based protocols, because you don't want to provide a full VPN client and giving access to the entire network. You'd want to have a service that provides the only required access to a specific application. In combination, that you are able to verify the health of the user credential, the user identity, and also verify the health of the device that the user is coming from. So having these different mechanisms in place can check before the user is allowed access to an internal application that they might need to access. So these are the two main services that have been announced. But of course, when it comes to secure private access, this is already a pretty big ecosystem of vendors in this mix already. So Microsoft has some of the same functionality. VMware has a pretty different architecture, because they've went into a partnership with a third party called Menlo. Cloudflare is moving into this ecosystem, and the same with Checkpoint and the other security providers as well. So many of these provide this much of the same features and functionality, but of course, Checkpoint and Palo Alto is more from a networking security perspective, while for instance, Citrix and VMware is looking more at providing access not just to web and internal or TCP, UDP based applications, but also providing Windows applications, desktops. And of course, we have, as I said, one of the main issues that I've been facing is now moving away from traditional VPNs and trying to provide a simple way for end users to gain access to these internal applications, where you can verify either from the credential from Azure Active Directory, or getting device context from Carbon Black, or from Windows Intune Endpoint Manager. So you have a compliant device that's trying to authenticate. And of course, there are a lot of good options there as well, pretty lightweight, because in some cases you might not need access to a virtualized desktop application, just want to have this form of network connectivity on the inside. And of course, you have Teleport, Cloudflare Access, Azure Application Proxy, and of course, you have Citrix and Palo Alto, as well as some of these vendors in this ecosystem that provide this type of functionality. So moving on to more Citrix updates. There's been a lot of updates, especially to machine creation services and from an Azure context. They now support ephemeral disks, which are non-persistent disks in Azure, which provide, of course, a higher throughput, but of course, it's non-persistent. So if the machine stops or restarts, all the data is gone, but it is supported from an MCS perspective. It's also now supported to you can define specific settings on a machine profile, such as accelerated networking, boot diagnostics, different tags, and you can also customize the host disk caching, and it will be inherited from the machine catalog if you provision up machines in Azure. The Workspace app, a lot of updates there. First off, supports Windows Hello and FIDO2 authentication. So that means you can authenticate to Citrix Workspace with the YubiKey, for instance. It also now provides support for Azure AD single sign-on natively. And also the Workspace app for Chrome OS now also has an optimized team support, meaning that video and audio content is offloaded down to the endpoint instead of running within the VDI or within the desktop. I was hoping that I can also announce the next long-term service release here as well, but that is something that is coming in this quarter. So I'm guessing they have about a month or so before they will announce the new LTSR release. We also have Rendezvous version 2 protocol, which is of course a pretty big change. It is in currently, I think it's in private or public preview, but with this new Rendezvous version 2 protocol, it means that we can bypass the cloud connectors, both from a control plane but also data plane perspective. So it means that the VDA or the architecture within Citrix then operates much like with AVD, that you have a agent installed, meaning the VDA, which will then communicate directly with the cloud service. So for environments where you plan to set up Azure Active Directory joined devices, then you will no longer require the cloud connectors for that specific type of design. However, if you want to set up virtual machines integrated with Active Directory, then you will still need to have the cloud connectors in place. But for the Azure AD joined deployment type, which is now currently in preview, is supported by MCS. There are some limitations, however, that it's only for single sessions, and it does not provide single sign-on at this time. But I'm guessing this is a limitation. I'm guessing this is a limitation based on the Windows operating system and not something Citrix has control of, because it's the same limitation that we have within Windows 365 and AVD. Now, there was a question here as well. Rendezvous will need Citrix Cloud ADC Gateway, or will they be available for on-prem ADC and CVAD services? As of now, my current understanding is this requires the gateway service. And then again, but then again, that also means that's a component running directly on the VDA itself. But I think it's documented in the preview program that it's not supporting on-prem ADC. So of course, that also means that you need to be aware of the different points of presence that Citrix has on available, because traffic will flow through one of these different points of presence. So for me in Norway, it means the traffic will go through down to North Europe and back again to where my desktops are hosted. So that's, but they are constantly documenting all these different locations where they're placing up new AD or placing up new points of presence. So this is documented on Citrix's website. And then we have service continuity, which is a combination of different features, but it is based upon the connection leasing mechanism. So when you enable service continuity and a user logs on to the Workspace app, it will automatically create an access token for each application that they have available. So if case the authentication mechanism goes down, they will still be able to access their applications because they already have a token created that is available on the device. Now, by default, these connection lease files are stored for 7 days, but it's something that you can customize. And Workspace app, which is now a progressive web app, also enumerates directly if there's applications that are not available as well. But service continuity requires that you have Citrix Cloud and you have the NetScaler Gateway as a service. You also have a new feature now called fallback to storefront. So in case Citrix Workspace is unavailable or the cloud-based storefront, your Workspace app can then communicate directly back to an on-prem storefront instance that you have. In addition, there's been a lot of enhancements to the protocol. First off is something called adaptive throughput, which essentially means that they can push more data through the HDX channel. And then of course, this means that they can provide much higher FPS, for instance, like for HD or 3D Pro, HDX 3D Pro, which they've now moved up to 120 frames per second, which I think was the latest announcement that they had in December. So pushing more data through the wire. They also now have support for HDX screen sharing. So if you have a workspace or you have a session enabled, you can share that desktop with another user so they can go in and you can work on the same session through the Workspace app. And then we have Citrix PVS in Azure, which is something that is, I think it's still in tech preview if I remember correctly. Now, one of the reasons why this has taken so long is because PVS has of course been relying on Pixie Boot, which has not been available or not supported in Azure. So with the previous tech preview that is now, you were required to use Generation 2 virtual machines, which supports UEFI boot. So there's a small virtual machine close to 20 megabytes that you set up in Azure boot and download the image from the file share that you have. Now, it's not a native cloud service yet. You require a lot of servers within Azure to actually get us up and running. So SQL Server, provisioning server, file share, licensing server, and so on. So hopefully this will be a more native cloud service with time. Now I also see that Derek corrected me here saying that PVA Azure, so that's good to hear. But at this time, at least, it's not, you can't reuse existing images that you built on-prem, so we need new images to run in Azure. In addition to this, Citrix ADC now also supports accelerated networking, which provides lower latency connectivity from the network card ADC down to the physical network card within the host that's running on. So that's definitely something that you should enable on all machines to provide lower latency. Then we have adaptive access, which is pretty similar to what we had before with Smart Access on NetScaler and Citrix. I can't remember the version, but what it actually does is that depending on where the user is located, when it's trying to log into Citrix Workspace, it will show different applications. So you can define different filters and define what kind of applications that should be available from the office or from home. Citrix have also introduced something called a Workspace browser, which is a Chromium-based browser that is embedded into the Workspace app. And this is, of course, tightly integrated with different from the Citrix Secure Private Access mechanism. So if you want to access internal web applications, it will then provide that access through the embedded browser session that is in Workspace. You can also use this in combination with watermarking and the screen sharing protection mechanism as well. You have the VDI upgrade service, which is also a new feature in preview, which allows you to automatically update the VDA as long as a new release is available, not for LTSR releases, but current releases. Citrix has also published, or they showed something on the Launchpad session last year where they showed that Citrix Workspace will be an application that will be available within Microsoft Teams. I haven't seen anything related to when it's available, but that's something that's coming, so you can allow users to start applications directly from within Microsoft Teams. Final thing I want to mention here is that multi-type licensing also just went GA, so you can combine different licensing SKUs within Citrix Cloud as well. In addition to this, Citrix is also pushing heavily for support with Google Cloud, so that you can both use MCS, you can use application layering. PVS is also something that they're having, I think it's in tech preview now, but it's also coming for Google Cloud. Because Google Cloud doesn't have a native VDI service like you have within Azure or Amazon, even though there are a lot of third-party providers that have VDI functionality within Google, such as Nutanix and Workspace. So I think this is a more strategic investment from Citrix side and looking into Google Cloud, because it's Google Cloud is maybe my favorite cloud provider in terms of functionality and stability, and not least performance-wise. Citrix also introduced image portability service, which actually went GA yesterday. So I needed to do a lot of updates to this slide deck, but it means that you can create an image on-prem and then export it into cloud providers such as Google Cloud or Microsoft Azure. So there are some different workflows depending on if you have MCS or PVS, but it is available now, and a lot of documentation is up and running as well. So if you have, of course, environments that are spread across different environments, public cloud and on-prem, you should definitely look into that service. Now, from the VMware side, not much updates going on there. They entered into a partnership with a vendor called Better Cloud, which is looking into SaaS-based management, so not just mapping what kind of applications that the users are accessing, but also to do management of those SaaS applications. So, example that you see here is offboarding of employees through different SaaS applications. VMware is also working on the next generation of the control plane for Horizon, which will be much more similar to what Citrix has with their Citrix Cloud and the cloud connectors. They're also investing heavily into virtual reality, which I'm not going to spend any time on right now, but they're also looking into a new feature with application volumes. Which is a way to provide pre-packaged applications either using VHD or VHDX. And application on demand means that when a user clicks on an application or a shortcut on the desktop, then application volumes will then mount the application on that specific machine. I see I'm running a little bit short on time, so I'll just cover the geeky news quickly. Terraform support for Citrix ADC available. So if you're looking or using Terraform today through provisioned virtual infrastructure, I highly recommend that you look into that as well. Also, you can now run when you download the ICA file, by default it downloads it on disk and starts it in Workspace, but then also now supporting to run directly in memory. So of course, pretty good from a security perspective. You can also now define custom domain names for the Citrix Workspace as well. So I've added a link to how you actually do that configuration. And of course, maybe the biggest news of them all is that application layering now also has a new web UI not based on Silverlight, which was end of life in October 2021. They still have both the Silverlight portal and the new web portal available at the same time, because there are some mechanisms that are not available in the new UI yet, but hopefully we'll get there soon. So with that, I think I've come to the final slide. So what does actually 2022 hold for us that are working within the EUC space? Well, most likely, and this is like personal, well, what I think personally, but I see that we'll have more vulnerabilities that we need to take care of, more patching, more workarounds that we need to have in place, but hopefully we'll have much more mature security products, much more mature to the different zero trust principles. And of course, we see that with as part of COVID, many organizations now are moving more to public cloud, and also meaning that we need to handle more fully remote employees when it comes to onboarding and management. And still, I'm guessing we're going to see even more bad licensing changes from Microsoft during the year. That always happens. And it's also going to be interesting to see in which direction the Citrix is going to move as part of the new organizational structure. But it's really good to see that there's been so much new development, new features that have been coming out the last year. So it's going to be really interesting to see what kind of new features that we'll see throughout the year. So with that, I think I'll wrap things up just before we came to the hour, but I don't see any additional questions that I haven't answered so far. Let me just take a quick look. No, it seems like I've answered all the questions. If you have any additional questions, you can also, of course, feel free to reach out to me directly. Stephanie has also added the link to where the presentation is stored, so you have all the links there. And with that, thank you so much for listening, and enjoy the rest of the day.
Thank you, Marius. Thanks so much. It's so good to have you back today. I think this is such a great webinar. I love that you do this for us, and I hope that you'll continue, because there's so much great information, and I think it's definitely a popular one.
That's good to hear. Yeah, it's a lot of content that you need to try to wrap into an hour. And when I did the dry run, I spent like 50 minutes. I was like, oh, this is pretty good. And now I see I spend a lot more time.
Maybe next year we need a 90-minute session.
Yeah, I'll have that. Yeah, I'll write that down just to make sure of it.
I'm sure people would love it. All right, well, thank you so much. I hope you all enjoy the rest of your day. And again, that recording link will be out to you tomorrow, so just be on the lookout for that. And thanks again. We'll see you around Twitter and CUGC and everywhere else. Everyone have a great afternoon, evening, and stay healthy and happy. Thanks, Marius.